Kuhn Review, print speaking to the blind, celebrating 40 years of audio newspaper production. Welcome to this week's edition of the National Podcast, recorded at the Bishop Briggs Media Centre by our amazing volunteers. You can get in touch with us via Facebook, Twitter or Instagram using @KuhnReview, that is @CuendReview. You can also contact us directly by emailing information@kuhnreview.com. That is INFORMATION or by calling 0141 772 3976. That's 0141 772 3976.
From The National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the Politics section. John Curtice in warning to SNP and Labour after Hamilton by-election. Article written by Xander Elliots. Professor John Curtice has issued a warning to both Labour and the SNP after the surprise results of the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. The polling expert was appearing on the BBC after it was announced that Davy Russell had won the by-election for Scottish Labour, becoming the party's 23rd MSP with 31.5% of the total vote. The SNP was second, with their candidate, Katie Loudon, picking up 29.4% of the vote, while Reform UK's Ross Lambie was a close third with 26.2%. Speaking to the BBC, Professor Curtice said that the result had confirmed the evidence of the opinion polls, but that Reform's level of support was a bit of a surprise. He explained, "The revival of the Labour Party that took place in the 2 years running up to the general election has indeed disappeared. The party is indeed more or less back to where it was in 2021. But at the same time, with the SNP vote down by 17 points, here is more than ample evidence that indeed the SNP, while it might have steadied the ship psychologically, has still made very little progress in advancing on where it was at last summer." Curtice said that the vote result showed that there was a chunk of pro-yes voters who had backed Labour in the 2024 general election and have not returned to the SNP fold. He added, "This election confirms very, very clearly that the SNP still have an awful lot of work to do to get those voters back on side, and it does illustrate that indeed, although given if this kind of result were to be reflected across the whole of Scotland, we'd still bet about the SNP being the largest party, they are still on relatively fragile ground." The University of Strathclyde expert further said that Reform UK's vote share had been a bit of a surprise given the national polls. He went on, "That 26% almost matches their best performance in the Scottish local government by-election in Clydebank. It is higher than we would expect given the current polls in Scotland. It certainly is very bad news for the Conservative Party, who are frankly being had for breakfast, lunch and dinner by Reform at the moment so far as the public is concerned. They're at 18% in the GB-wide polls, they're down to 12% in the Scotland polls. The Conservative Party cannot afford for Reform to gain momentum north of the border." However, he went on to issue a warning to the SNP and Labour, saying both parties need to think about how they are going to effectively deal with Reform. Curtice said, "For all the complaints about Nigel Farage's ad, attacking Anas Sarwar, it is not clear from this result that it did any damage. I think I would point out to both the SNP and the Labour Party that what they ended up doing in this by-election campaign was giving an awful lot of publicity to a message that they thought was not a very good idea. One of the first rules in politics is to avoid scratching the itch of things you do not like because you simply end up potentially giving them airtime. And the truth is that evidently Mr Farage's message was not sufficiently unacceptable for at least a body of people in Hamilton for Reform to record a quite notable share of this vote, and certainly the highest share of the vote won in a parliamentary contest by any anti-EU party in Scotland." Asked where Reform's vote had come from, Curtice said, "Around 1 in 4 of the people who voted Conservative last year, diminished in number as they were, in Scotland are switching to Reform. But Labour are also losing somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5 of their voters to Reform of the ones they had last year." He added that Scottish voters who backed Labour in 2024 are more likely to switch to Reform than English voters, saying that south of the border, Labour are losing about 10% of their vote to Reform. That article was written by Xander Elliotts and read to you by Elizabeth. From the National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the news section. Labour considering Brit Card ID plans, Minister confirms. Article written by Hamish Morrison. The government is absolutely looking at the idea of digital ID cards, a Cabinet Minister has said. Environment Secretary Steve Reid said that ministers know we need to look at all the actions we can take to reduce illegal migration. It comes amid report number 10 are looking at plans for a so-called Brit Card, a digital ID on a smartphone that could be used to check on somebody's right to live and work in the UK. Speaking to Times Radio on Friday morning, Reid said, "It's absolutely something that we are looking at and that we should be looking at." He added, "We know we need to look at all the actions we can take to stop the levels of illegal migration that we are seeing, particularly under the last government. We have to stop the number of people that we've seen who don't have a right to come here. There's a discussion going on, and I'm happy to take part in that discussion as well. I think it's absolutely right that we should be looking at this. It's something that's been talked about for quite a while. The government referenced it in a white paper, but now there will be a more detailed conversation." Plans for the Brit Card have been put forward by the think tank Labour Together. In the foreword to their report on the ID, two new Labour MPs say that it will not be a silver bullet to the problem of illegal migration, but should form an important part of Labour's enforcement strategy. Jake Richards and Adam Joji said, "There can be no doubt that this is the kind of ambitious, progressive project a Labour government should pursue to protect our borders and empower our citizens." Labour previously ruled out bringing in digital ID cards, with Home Secretary Yvette Cooper saying in July, "That's not our approach." Former Labour leader Tony Blair has been a long-standing advocate of ID cards, which critics say violate people's privacy. As Prime Minister, he brought in identity cards on a voluntary basis, with just 15,000 being issued before the scheme was scrapped by the coalition government in 2011. That article was written by Hamish Morrison and read to you by Elizabeth. From the National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the Politics section. SNP campaign chief Jamie Hepburn reacts to Hamilton by-election loss. Article written by Laura Pollock. The SNP's campaign chief, Jamie Hepburn, has reacted to his party's by-election loss, addressing the lack of focus on independence during the campaign. Hepburn, MSP for Cumbernauld and Kilsyth, who previously served as Scotland's first independence minister before First Minister John Swinney scrapped the role last year, said the SNP has no sense of terror in the face of Reform UK's rise. The campaign coordinator appeared on Good Morning Scotland on Friday after Labour won in Hamilton, Lark Hall and Stonehouse. The party have been heavily criticised for its lack of focus on independence by the wider movement, with Keir Starmer this week telling the press that the First Minister had not raised it directly with him in conversation and rejecting the idea of another referendum during his tenure as Prime Minister. When asked whether he believed independence was high on the agenda for voters after a pro-union vote seen yesterday, Hepburn said, "I think that's a fairly simplistic analysis of the campaign. Clearly a by-election campaign has a life of its own. Next year we're going into a general election for the Scottish Parliament, and it'll be a very different context. The fundamental question will be who's forming the Scottish Government? Who's going to be the next First Minister? That's clearly going to be either John Swinney or Anas Sarwar. I think when we get into that context, people will be thinking differently, and independence will be part of that campaign." Hepburn added, "We'll need to consider the proposition that we've laid out at this by-election and how that may influence the propositions we lay out at the coming general election next year that we know is ahead of us. It's just the morning after the night before, so we'll take some time to consider that." That article was written by Laura Pollock and read to you by Elizabeth. From the National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the news section. Teachers balloted for strike action over excessive workloads. Article written by Gregor Young. Teachers are being urged to vote for strike action in a bid to send a message to ministers on excessive workloads. Scotland's largest teaching union, the EIS, is launching a consultative ballot for industrial action during its annual general meeting on Friday. The ballot comes in the wake of a survey by the union which revealed more than 2/3 of teachers, 44%, work an additional 7 unpaid hours in a typical week. The research also found 11.5% of teachers work an extra 15 hours or more per week, the equivalent of 2 days. EIS General Secretary Andrea Bradley said the ballot will highlight the pressing need to deliver on a commitment to cut the time teachers spend in the classroom. The SNP 2021 manifesto pledged to reduce this by 1.5 hours a week, with Bradley insisting action is needed to reduce excessive teacher workload. Speaking ahead of the AGM, which is taking place in Aviemore, she said, "This ballot is an opportunity for our members to send a clear message to their employers and the Scottish Government of the need to honour the commitment to tackle excessive teacher workload by reducing weekly class contact time." Accusing the Scottish Government and local authority leaders in COSLA of failing to deliver the promised reduction in classroom time, she called on union members to vote in favour of industrial action, including strikes. Bradley said, "Only sending a strong and clear message will compel the Scottish Government and COSLA to finally take action to tackle teacher workload." She told how teachers have waited more than 4 years for the time they spend in classes to be reduced, saying in the meantime workload pressures continue to soar. Bradley added, "This is having a detrimental impact on the health and well-being of teachers, with significant consequences for the learning experience of pupils in our schools." The recent EIS survey revealed the scale of the workload demands that are being placed on teachers, she said, adding this showed almost half of those in the profession are working the equivalent of an extra day per week to keep on top of their workload. On the commitment to reduce class contact time by 1.5 hours per week, she said the Scottish Government and COSLA have failed even to produce any firm proposals on how to take this forward. The EIS ballot comes as a second union, the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association, SSTA, is also preparing to hold a consultative survey on strike action on the issue. SSTA General Secretary Seamus Searson said, "The reduction of 90 minutes class contact time was promised by the Scottish Government 4 years ago, and COSLA has balked at every turn to progress the promise. The reduction of class contact time is a small step in addressing teacher workload, and the employers have failed to acknowledge the importance of the 90 minutes to teachers. SSTA members have reached the end of their patience, and they have no option but to resort to taking strike action to force the employers to implement a real benefit for hard-pressed secondary school teachers. To get to this point shows a lack of respect and understanding by the employers of the challenges teachers are facing to deliver education." The SSTA said its survey will start in the week of June 16 and run until the end of August. A Scottish Government spokesperson said, "The Scottish Government will continue to work with unions and COSLA to agree our approach to delivering a reduction in class contact time, which ultimately requires agreement from the whole Scottish Negotiating Committee for Teachers. This is also why we are providing local authorities with an additional £186.5 million to restore teacher numbers, alongside an additional £29 million to support the recruitment and retention of the ASN workforce. This funding has been provided on the clear agreement that meaningful progress is made on reducing teacher class contact time." That article was written by Gregor Young and read to you by Elizabeth. From The National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the Politics section. This is the genuine silver lining in the SNP by-election loss. Article written by James Kelly, analyst. Amidst the bitter disappointment for the SNP of failing to live up to their tag as bookies' favourites in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, there is a genuine silver lining. The result is consistent with the current Scotland-wide opinion polls being accurate. The swing implied by the Norstat poll a few days ago suggested that the SNP ought to defeat Labour in the by-election by a tiny margin of less than 1 percentage point, whereas in fact Labour came out on top by just over 2 points. That's a trivial difference, and thus the result lends support to the main message of the polls, which is that the SNP enjoy a substantial nationwide lead on the Holyrood constituency ballot. Hamilton should not be mistaken for a bellwether constituency. It's significantly tilted towards Labour, in the sense that if support for the SNP and Labour was roughly tied across Scotland, Labour would likely be winning Hamilton by a double-digit margin. It's absolutely possible for the SNP to remain the largest single party in the Scottish Parliament if they lose in Hamilton again next May, and even if they lose by a bigger margin than they did in the by-election. The potential problem, however, is that by-election results do not just passively provide insights into the present state of play. They can also in themselves be drivers of public opinion. In particular, surprise by-election outcomes often generate snowball effects in favour of the winning party. The SNP are still haunted by the memory of how their unexpectedly heavy drubbing in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election in 2023 provided Labour with a springboard that helped propel Keir Starmer to a majority of Scottish seats in the 2024 general election. Fortunately, there's a good reason for doubting that a similar effect will occur after Hamilton. The UK Labour government is one of the most hapless administrations in living memory, and it seems entirely plausible that within a few days the afterglow of the by-election result will be overshadowed by yet another misstep from Starmer or Rachel Reeves. If the SNP can just weather the short-term storm of a few painful headlines, it's conceivable that within a few months they'll look back at this by-election as having no real significance beyond the obvious fact that it reduced their contingent of MSPs by 1. That said, it's also important to consider the question of the dog that didn't bark. The only reason the Labour win comes as a surprise is that expectations of a massive Reform UK breakthrough and a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform have been allowed to run away with themselves. If the result had played out in line with those expectations, there was a theory that John Swinney would have been in a no-lose situation, because he could have used any Reform win to rally the anti-Farage vote behind the SNP, who would have looked like the only remaining alternative to a Reform-led government in Edinburgh. Instead, Anas Sarwar has been reconfirmed as the leading challenger to Swinney, albeit only just, and it's obviously a lot harder to paint Sarwar as a bogeyman. But in truth, it's perhaps just as well for the SNP that Reform weren't able to use Hamilton to establish themselves as the main opposition party in Scotland. If they had done, there's a danger that the rump Tory vote might have moved across to Farage en masse and pushed Reform to the type of vote share where they could have seriously threatened the SNP on the constituency ballot next year. There's something to be said for staying in the more familiar territory of an SNP v Labour battle, not least because Starmer's unpopularity ought to ensure there is a hard ceiling on Labour support next May. Another consolation for the SNP is that they can point to their narrow defeat as a timely wake-up call for the independence movement. The Scottish Green candidate in Hamilton took 695 votes, amounting to a 2.6% vote share. If there had been no Green candidate, and if the SNP had taken at least 87% of Green votes, Labour would have been defeated. In practice, that's not what would have happened in the real world, so the Green intervention did not cost the SNP victory. But it's now clear that there are some Central Belt constituencies that the SNP will not win next year, unless they can squeeze votes from smaller, pro-independence parties, and unless they can persuade disillusioned SNP voters not to stay at home. A few constituencies here or there could make all the difference between retaining the pro-independence majority at Holyrood and losing it. That article was written by James Kelly and read to you by Elizabeth.
From the National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the comment section, we have to stop criminalising people who need help. By Simon MacLean. Last week I had the privilege of attending the Association of Scottish Superintendents annual conference, accompanied by my former colleague and retired inspector Ian Andrew. We were there representing LEAP Scotland, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and, as ever, the gathering proved to be a space of reflection, rigorous discussion and shared determination to make Scotland safer and more just for all who live here. The theme of this year's conference, working smarter not harder, struck a timely chord. In a climate of rapid technological advancement and growing operational demands, that sentiment has never been more important. We heard from an impressive array of speakers, including Chief Constable Joe Farrell and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, Angela Constance. Topics range from the practical deployment of facial recognition software to broader concerns about workload, well-being and the future of policing in Scotland. Yet, amid all the talk of innovation and efficiency, one word kept recurring, not only from the podium but from the floor. From serving officers, senior leaders and community stakeholders, that word was trust. Trust is not a new concept in policing, but it is a foundational one. In Scotland, our model of policing by consent is rooted in the idea that our authority as law enforcers comes not from fear or dominance, but from legitimacy. That legitimacy is hard-earned and easily lost. It rests in the perception that the police act with integrity, that we are fair, honest and committed to the safety of all citizens, not just in words, but in deeds. We must remember that this trust has been built over generations by officers who walked the beat, faced danger and upheld justice even under immense pressure. Trust is not automatic. It is not confirmed by uniform or title. It must be continually earned through transparency, accountability and above all through moral clarity. And that brings me to the heart of the matter, a question that grows more urgent with each passing year. How can we continue to maintain public trust when we are compelled to enforce laws that, in effect, do more harm than good? In particular, I refer to Scotland's long-standing approach to drug policy, an approach grounded in criminalisation, deterrence and punishment. Despite decades of aggressive enforcement and billions spent, this strategy has failed by nearly every metric. Our morgues bear silent witness to that failure. Our streets, our families, our communities continue to suffer. We have known for years, decades even, that the so-called war on drugs is not only unwinnable, but deeply counterproductive. It criminalises the vulnerable, strengthens the gap of organised crime and drives a wedge between law enforcement and the communities we are supposed to serve. The question must be asked again with more urgency. How can we reconcile the need for public trust with the continued enforcement of drug laws that disproportionately affect the most marginalised, while allowing the true profiteers, dealers and criminal gangs, to flourish in every town and city across the country? The existing approach does not make our communities safer. It condemns those struggling with addiction to a cycle of criminalisation and despair, while doing little to stem the supply or reduce the harm. The result is a landscape in which those in need of help are treated as criminals, and those feeling the problem operate with impunity. This is not abstract rhetoric. In 2019, the SNP made a bold and principled decision by passing a resolution that recognised current drug laws as not fit for purpose. The party formally backed the decriminalisation of possession and called for powers to be devolved so that Scotland could chart its own path forward. At the time, many of us, inside and outside policing, felt a surge of hope. Finally, it seemed our political leaders were willing to face facts, that criminalisation doesn't work, that compassion is not weakness, that public health is not separate from public safety, it is its foundation. And yet, here we are in 2025 still waiting for those promises to manifest into real change. Worse still, we see signs of backtracking. Proposals to expand criminalisation in other areas, such as around street prostitution, suggest a reversion to policies that target the symptoms of societal breakdown rather than the causes. Did we ever truly understand the lessons from the Violence Reduction Unit? Did we ever really mean what we said about treating addiction, poverty and exploitation as public health crises rather than crimes? It has now been 23 years since Scotland's Violence Reduction Unit pioneered a groundbreaking model that addressed violent crime not as a policing issue, but as a societal one. That approach, rooted in prevention, early intervention and wraparound support, has been internationally celebrated. But have we truly taken those principles to heart? Or do we continue to reach for the same blunt tools, prohibition, punishment, surveillance, when what's needed is imagination, humanity and leadership? To continue down our current path is to ensure more lives are lost, more families destroyed and more trust eroded. That is not a price we should be willing to pay. So I return to the conference theme, working smarter not harder. If we are truly committed to working smarter, we must apply that thinking to the laws we enforce. We must stop criminalising people who need help and instead go after the systems that keep them trapped. We must take control away from organised crime and bring it back into the hands of public institutions through regulation, oversight and care. I have said it before and I will say it again. It is time for change. Time for honesty. Time for an emergency response equal to the scale of the crisis we face. Let us be brave enough to reimagine our justice system. Let us have the courage to align our policies with our values. And above all, let us never forget that trust, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. Scotland cannot afford to wait another generation to get this right. That was a comment piece by Simon McLean, who is a former drug squad officer and, together with former Deputy Chief Constable Tom Wood, hosts a successful podcast, Crime Time Inc. Both are successful authors. And it was read by Ian McKenna. From the National, Friday the 6th of June 2025, from the comment section, analysis. This is what the Hamilton by-election tells us about SNP chances for 2026. By James Kelly. Amidst the bitter disappointment for the SNP of failing to live up to their tag as bookies' favourite in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, there is a genuine silver lining. The result is consistent with the current Scotland-wide opinion polls being accurate. The swing implied by the Nordstat poll a few days ago suggested that the SNP ought to defeat Labour in the by-election by a tiny margin of less than 1 percentage point, whereas in fact Labour came out on top by just over 2 points. That's a trivial difference, and thus the result lends support to the main message of the polls, which is that the SNP enjoy a substantial nationwide lead on the Holyrood constituency ballot. Hamilton should not be mistaken for a bellwether constituency. It's significantly tilted towards Labour, in the sense that if support for the SNP and Labour was roughly tied across Scotland, Labour would likely be winning Hamilton by a double-digit margin. It's absolutely possible for the SNP to remain the single largest party in the Scottish Parliament if they lose in Hamilton again next May, and even if they lose by a bigger margin than they did in the by-election. The potential problem, however, is that by-election results do not just passively provide insights into the present state of play, they can also themselves be drivers of public opinion. In particular, surprise by-election outcomes often generate snowball effects in favour of the winning party. The SNP are still haunted by the memory of how their unexpectedly heavy drubbing in Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election in 2023 provided Labour with a springboard that helped propel Keir Starmer to a majority of Scottish seats in the 2024 general election. Fortunately, there is a good reason for doubting that a similar effect will occur after Hamilton. The UK Labour government is one of the most hapless administrations in living memory, and it seems entirely plausible that within a few days, the afterglow of the by-election result will be overshadowed by yet another misstep from Starmer or Rachel Reeves. If the SNP can just weather the short-time storm of a few painful headlines, it's conceivable that within a few months they'll look back at this by-election as having no real significance beyond the obvious fact that it reduced their contingent of MSPs by 1. That said, it's also important to consider the question of the dog that didn't bark. The only reason the Labour win comes as a surprise is that the expectations of a massive Reform UK breakthrough, and a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform, had been allowed to run away with themselves. If the result had played out in line with those expectations, there was a theory that John Swinney would have been in a no-lose situation because he could have used any Reform win to rally the anti-Farage vote behind the SNP, who would have looked like the only remaining alternative to a Reform-led government in Edinburgh. Instead, Anas Sarwar has been reconfirmed as the leading challenger to Swinney, albeit only just, and it's obviously a lot harder to paint Sarwar as a bogeyman. But in truth, it's perhaps just as well for the SNP that Reform weren't able to use Hamilton to establish themselves as the main opposition party in Scotland. If they had done, there's a danger that the rump Tory vote might have been moved across to Farage en masse, and pushed Reform to the type of vote share where they could have seriously threatened the SNP on the constituency ballot next year. There's something to be said for staying in the more familiar territory of an SNP v Labour battle, not least because Starmer's unpopularity ought to ensure there is a hard ceiling on Labour support next May. Another consolation for the SNP is that they can point to their narrow defeat as a timely wake-up call for the independence movement. the Scottish Green candidate in Hamilton took 695 votes, amounting to a 2.6% vote share. If there had been no Green candidate and the SNP had taken at least 87% of Green votes, Labour would have been defeated. In practice, that's not what would have happened in the real world, so the Green intervention did not cost the SNP victory. But it's now clear that there are some Central Belt constituencies that the SNP will not win next year unless they can squeeze votes from smaller pro-independence parties and unless they can persuade disillusioned SNP voters not to stay at home. A few constituencies here or there can make all the difference between retaining the pro-independence majority at Holyrood and losing it. And that article was written by James Kelly and read by Ian McKenna. From the National, Sunday the 8th of June 2025, from the comment section. Owen Jones. The UK media has ignored this hugely revealing scandal. By contributor Owen Jones. Someone suggesting that Israel is in cahoots with ISIS would normally be branded a crank and a deranged and hateful conspiracy theorist. And yet, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister subject to an International Criminal Court arrest warrant, has been accused of forging this alliance by the Israeli political class. And yet, once again, the Westminster media has overwhelmingly failed to cover this latest profoundly revealing scandal. Avigdor Lieberman is a far-right opposition leader who once served as Netanyahu's Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Defence Minister. This week he publicly announced the Israeli government is giving weapons to a group of criminals and felons identified with Islamic State at the direction of the Prime Minister. Did Netanyahu come out swinging, accusing his opponent of anti-Semitism, as he did when another opposition leader, former Israeli General Yair Golan, declared that Israel was killing babies as a hobby? He did not. Instead, Netanyahu bragged that Israel is working to defeat Hamas in various ways on the recommendation of all heads of the security establishment. In a video message, he clarified that Israel had activated clans in Gaza that oppose Hamas, shamelessly calling it a good thing, which is saving the lives of Israeli soldiers. What's wrong with that? We're talking here about a militia beheaded by a man named Yasser Abu Shabab. He styles his faction as an anti-terror service, but is a criminal gang operating in an area of Rafah firmly under Israeli military control. His own family has not only disowned him, but backed his execution. According to Palestinian analyst Mohammed Shihada, his militia is composed of 300 drug dealers and criminals. And here's an important detail. To justify imposing a total siege on Gaza, Israel claimed that Hamas was stealing humanitarian food. Among those pointing out that this wasn't true was Cindy McCain, widow of the late Hawkesh Republican Senator John McCain, and now director of the World Food Programme. But we do know that Shabab's Israel-backed gang has been stealing aid, as ever with the Israeli authorities. Every accusation is a confession. This is just another plank of Israel's starvation policy, but again, the Western media has overwhelmingly failed to clearly spell out what Israel is actually doing. Having imposed a total siege on Gaza since March the 2nd, Israel set up a US-backed shadow entity named the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to explicitly supplant the UN. It hasn't just been rejected by every aid agency. Even the US Marine who heads it resigned on the basis it contradicted the basic principles of humanitarianism. The foundation set 3 aid checkpoints in the south in an effort to concentrate Gaza's entire population into a confined area, a concentration camp. Too little aid was delivered, much of it unusual given the siege and cooking materials. But in any case, the Israeli military repeatedly fired on starving Palestinians. In the words of Tory MP Kit Malthouse, the UN system had been replaced with a shooting range, an abattoir. But when the Israeli military massacred dozens of starving Palestinians, they deployed their usual strategy: deceive, deflect, deny, distort. Even though the shootings happened in an Israeli military zone, and despite the overwhelming evidence of Israeli lies, the Western media indulged in Israeli claims that Hamas was responsible as if they were credible. CNN belatedly published a clear rebuttal of Israeli lies, but attention had already moved on. As ever, the Western media overall failed to show Israeli responsibility for atrocities to stick. And yet now, even as Yair Lapid, the main opposition leader, states Netanyahu is giving weapons to organisations close to ISIS in Gaza, this latest plank of Israel's starvation strategy barely gets any coverage. This is despite Israel's Hamas's ISIS campaign long being used to justify the genocide. This all fits a classic pattern, of course. Israel encouraged the rise of Hamas in the 1980s in order to undermine its public enemy number one at the time, Yasser Arafat's Fatah. More recently, Netanyahu worked with Qatar to transfer money to prop up Hamas, with the hope of dividing the Palestinian nation and movement so an independent state was impossible. Remember too how the West armed and backed the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, playing a crucial role in creating the global Islamist fundamentalist movement. You would think the Western media might take an interest given the precedents. It is true that there is a shift taking place. Israeli spokespeople are suddenly being taken apart on mainstream television. Sky News is demanding the Prime Minister answer if genocide is taking place. But the media narrative still has not clearly shifted to reality. That is, a crime of historic proportions has been facilitated by Western governments, which means questions should be focused on how can the crime be stopped and perpetrators held to justice, rather than, is Israel doing something very bad here? The latter is an improvement on what the narrative was stuck on for so long, which was essentially, Israel is waging a war of self-defence, with a side debate about whether the response was proportionate. What is clear is that an understanding is creeping into the political and media elites that a reckoning is coming, where those who facilitated this abomination will be forced to answer for what they did and what they didn't do. Time is running out. And that was a comment piece by Owen Jones, read by Ian McKenna. From the National, Monday the 9th of June 2025, from the comment section. Kenny McCaskill, SNP losing by-election was unforgivable. Although not an SNP member, I grieved at the Hamilton by-election result while holding in contempt those culpable for it. The town's name is seared in Scotland's soul from Winnie Ewing's victory there in the UK Parliament by-election in 1967. I was a child then, but was aware of its seismic effect not just on Scottish politics, but Scottish society. Many stalwarts told me how a movement viewed as marginal and romantic came alive with that triumph. Scottish politics was changing irrevocably, with independence becoming a possibility, not just a dream. More recently, when I was Justice Secretary, I worked with Christina McKelvey, an assiduous and popular MSP, as she sought to address knife crime in her community. The seat's loss is a bitter blow to the efforts of those stalwarts and countless others. Alba stood aside, calling on supporters to max a yes vote. Just what the Scottish Greens think they achieved by standing is for them to explain, with their total of votes barely greater than the very small Labour majority. Unionists are now crowing it, and the impact will be felt by the wider independence movement. It's a tragedy which will require work and change to come back from. It wasn't the fault of the SNP candidate any more than the success can be attributed to her spectacularly poor Labour opponent. The polish of New Labour was forsaken, with Davy Russell a throwback to Labour candidates from days of yore, when the party reigned across huge swathes of Scotland, its dead hand lying across the land. Under Alex Salmond's leadership, that Tammany Hill power was broken, and Scotland was transformed for the better. We cannot allow these dark days to return. Remember that this was also a defeat for what little remains of the Labour left, and those who still think Scotland can be transformed within the Union. Last week's result will be taken as an endorsement of Starmerism, legitimisation of the austerity agenda, and Labour's attacks on the poor and vulnerable. Those who have bravely spoken out will be hounded and party loyalists empowered. Responsibility for the defeat rests with the SNP leadership for both its lamentable by-election strategy and its actions and failings over recent years. Circumstances has changed from last year and were favourable for SNP. The tidal clamour for change last July, which saw myself and my Alba colleagues swept out of the UK Parliament, along with numerous SNP MPs, had well and truly ebbed. Starmer's Labour were and are deeply unpopular. At the same time, independence was polling well above 50% and even higher when the spectre of Farage and reform was posed. All good, you'd think, for pushing the case for independence. That was what, after all, was done by Winnie Ewing all those years ago, and decades before we even had our parliament restored. She gave a vision of the land Scotland could be, contrasting it with the country it was, as pits and shipyards started to close and immigration continued. But independence wasn't mentioned by the SNP. It was a policy notable only for its absence in literature, on the doorsteps and in debate. Yet it was the unique selling point for the SNP. It was the one thing that carved them out from their principal opponents, Labour and Reform, and, even more than that, was backed by well over half of voters. That failure is not just inexplicable, but unforgivable. Instead, a strategy of stop reform was pushed. Just what was that meant to express, other than avoiding having to answer for failings in the Scottish Government administration, is hard to fathom. In politics, saying what you're for is always better than arguing for what you're against. It motivates those who share your beliefs and can even earn respect or at least legitimation from opponents. Besides, Reform are not going to take power in Scotland, but only independence can ensure they are not foisted on us by being in the Union. The SNP leadership treated independent supporters in Hamilton with the same arrogance and disdain that they've treated the wider movement over recent years. A simple assumption that they'd have to vote for them in the backing of others could be safely pursued. Do what you're told and wish for Indy. But, as in 2017, where there's neither motivation nor articulation of independence, many simply stayed at home. The SNP did not lose support to Reform in Hamilton. Instead, they saw independent supporters say, "What's the point of voting?" That compounded growing contempt for their failings in office and their lack of vision for the country, an obsession with gender and identity when what is wanted is an improvement in public services, whether health or housing, jobs or justice, focusing on individual rights rather than the collective good at a time when communities are struggling. There has to be a coming together of the independence movement, but that requires a recognition by SNP that they're only a part, albeit a major part, of it. The growing gap between support for independence and support for SNP tells a story, and a bit of humility would go a long way. It also means that Holyrood 2026 has to be a plebiscite election, and that max to yes, it has to be vote Alba on the list. And that was a comment piece by Kenny McCaskill, read by E. McKenna. From the National, Monday the 9th of June 2025, from the comment section. SNP narrative of two-horse race is not inspiring or smart politics, by Tommy Shepherd. As the dust settles on the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election, what went wrong for the SNP and how do we put it right? The first piece perspective is that this should not have been a shock to anyone. The electoral wards that make up this seat have never been safe for any party. This is a political battleground that has been, is and will be an SNP Labour marginal. That's certainly what it felt like on the doors I knocked upon. The only reason it was heralded as a surprise result is because the SNP foolishly created a narrative that it was a race between them and Reform UK, neither of which came first. Undoubtedly it seemed like a good idea at the time, but in retrospect, it was a disaster. I cannot think of another example where the two-horse race line has been deliberately created by an incumbent. Usually, it's a story concocted by an opposition party to galvanise support for a challenge by asking supporters of other parties to lend them a vote. When the incumbent presents this argument, a number of unfortunate and unintended consequences result. First, it necessarily portrays the SNP as the status quo, signalling to a disgruntled electorate that they can get change by voting for someone else. Presenting yourself as being in pole position might even create a degree of apathy amongst your own supporters. Second, in defence, the argument has the reverse effect on your opponent that it might in attack. The other party, in this case Reform UK, are thus presented as the second most important party. Bigging up your opponent is just daft. The message to anyone flirting with Reform UK is that they are a serious contender, best placed to upset the SNP. We make their argument for them. The argument, of course, wasn't aimed at Reform voters, but at those who were alarmed by them, people swithering between Labour and SNP in particular. Clearly, most Labour voters, whether strong or weakly aligned, were not impressed. They did not believe the tactical game was as described, or, if they did, the danger didn't seem so great as to override other considerations. Thirdly, deploying the two-horse race narrative makes a voter's decision a tactical rather than a principled one. It doesn't allow for any argument about policy or performance. The decision is reduced to a least bad choice. This isn't inspiring politics. And when you are in an office, choosing not to talk about your intentions or achievements can look defensive, even a bit desperate. It certainly does when the party which is actually your main challenger are taking lumps out of you 24/7. The silver lining for the SNP is that it gets to learn from its mistakes. Whatever brain and spadland which came up with the two-horse race ruse will, I trust, be engaging in silent reflection. And hopefully, any notion that this might be the narrative for next year's national election will be put back in its box. There may well come a time when Scottish politics condenses into a binary choice between a Farage-led UK government and the lifeboat of independence, but we are not there yet, and that will not be how people see things next May. Many people have observed that the SNP really ought to be talking more about independence. They are right. It is, after all, the principal policy that makes us different from our main competitors. But it is essential that this isn't just performative. It doesn't matter how many times you see the word. What matters is convincing different people to join a political coalition in support of the principle. We need to be smart. Sure, a majority of people tell pollsters they'd like the country to be independent, but how strongly do they feel that? And do they think their vote in next year's election will affect that outcome? If the SNP is to move significantly beyond the 30% mark, it needs to reach out to two different constituencies on its flanks. One of these is a group of people who believe very strongly in independence, so strongly, in fact, that they rationalise not voting for the SNP because they think the party doesn't argue for independence enough. These people will continue abstaining until we set out a political strategy to mobilise the people behind demanding their right to choose their own future and challenge UK constitutional law, which currently prevents them doing so. On the other flank, though, are people who now say they support independence but see it as a long-term aspiration with no immediate relevance to the problems they face this week. A good few of them will have voted Labour last Thursday, maybe even some voted Reform. The SNP needs to reach out to these people by making independence relevant. Right here, right now. We need to show that independence is about the power to change everything, from cutting energy bills to stopping World War III. Do that and we give the electorate a much more compelling reason to vote for us than the fact that we're not a bunch of right-wing racists. A comment piece written by Tommy Shepherd, read by Ian McKenna.
From The National, Tuesday the 10th of June 2025, from the Politics section. 20 more Palestinians killed by Israel near aid points. Article written by James Walker. Dozens more Palestinians have reportedly been killed by Israel in their homes and while waiting for aid at Israeli and US-supported food distribution centres. Al Jazeera Arabic are reporting that 20 people have been killed and more than 124 injured this morning while waiting for aid near the so-called Netzarim corridor, south of Gaza City. It is the latest in a number of shootings that have killed around 150 people and wounded hundreds since the rollout of a new food distribution system, according to Gaza's health ministry. Israel and the US say the new system is designed to circumvent Hamas, but it has been rejected by the UN and major aid groups. Experts have meanwhile warned that Israel's blockade and its ongoing military campaign have put Gaza at risk of famine. Palestinians say Israeli forces have repeatedly fired towards crowds heading to the food centres since they opened last month. In previous instances, the Israeli military has said it fired warning shots at people who approached its forces near the centres, which are in military zones off limits to independent media. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the Israeli and US-supported private contractor running the sites, says there has been no violence in or around the centres themselves. Meanwhile, an Israeli strike on homes in Jabalia al-Balad, also this morning, has killed 9 Palestinians according to one of the organisation's sources at Al-Shifa Hospital. At least 3 Palestinians from the same family have also been killed in an Israeli attack on a tent housing displaced people near the city of Khan Yunis, according to a separate source. And that article was written by James Walker. From The National, Tuesday the 10th of June 2025, from the Politics section. Resign if you disagree, Labour tells civil servants over Israel. Article written by Xander Eliards. Hundreds of staff in the UK government's Foreign Office were told they could resign if they had concerns about how Labour are handling Israel's illegal actions in Palestine. The BBC reported that some 300 staff had signed a letter addressed to Foreign Secretary David Lammy last month, in which concerns were raised about UK complicity with Israel. The letter questions Labour's decision to continue to licence exports of military equipment to Israel, saying, in July 2024, staff expressed concern about Israel's violations of international humanitarian law and potential UK government complicity. In the intervening period, the reality of Israel's disregard for international law has become more stark. It further accused the UK government of contributing to the erosion of global norms, pointing to both the weapons exports and the secret visit to London in April by Israel's Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar. As The National previously reported, UK government figures have shown that more military equipment was licensed for export in the final 3 months of 2024, after Labour suspended some 10% of export licences, than had been licensed through all of 2020 to 2023. Labour have also refused to stop exporting parts for F-35 fighter jets, which Israel has used in Gaza, claiming that to do so would endanger UK military operations elsewhere, and has continued sending spy planes over Gaza to aid Israel. The BBC reported that the reply to the Foreign Office staff's concern was sent from Sir Oliver Robbins and Nick Dyer, the 2 most senior civil servants in the Foreign Office. It told the hundreds of staff that if their disagreement with any aspect of government policy or action is profound, your ultimate recourse is to resign from the civil service. This is an honourable course. The pair said that the bargain at the heart of the British civil service is that we sign up to deliver the policies of the government of the day wholeheartedly, within the limits imposed by the law and the Civil Service Code. The UK government's official position is that Israel is at risk of breaching international law. Foreign Secretary Lammy previously said Israel was breaching the law on multiple occasions, before U-turning in an embarrassing parliamentary climb-down. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is wanted for arrest by the International Criminal Court, and the country is facing credible accusations of committing genocide. The BBC reported that the dismissed letter was at least the 4th such document sent by concerned civil servants to ministers and the Foreign Office managers since late 2023. A Foreign Office spokesperson said there were systems in place which allow staff to raise concerns if they have them. And that article was written by Xander Eliards. From The National, Tuesday the 10th of June 2025, from the news section. Israel deports 4 Madleen activists as 8 remain in detention. Article written by Xander Eliards. Activist Greta Thunberg is being deported from Israel after the Gaza-bound ship she was on was seized by the Israeli military. Israel's Foreign Ministry shared a photo of Thunberg on a plane, saying that she was heading for France before continuing to Sweden. Adala, a legal rights group in Israel representing Thunberg and the other activists, said the suite 2 other campaigners and a journalist had agreed to be deported. Other activists refused deportation, were being held in detention, and their case was set to be heard by Israeli authorities. Rima Hassan, a French member of the European Parliament who is of Palestinian descent, is reported to be among the people to refuse deportation. Thunberg was one of 12 passengers on board the Madeleine, a boat carrying aid destined for people in war-torn Gaza. Israeli naval forces seized the boat early on Monday about 125 miles off Gaza's coast. It had been in international waters sailing under a UK red ensign, meaning it was under UK jurisdiction. After being illegally seized, the boat arrived in the Israeli port of Ashdod on Monday evening. The activists said they were protesting against the ongoing war and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Israel's foreign ministry tried to portray the voyage as a public relations stunt, saying on social media that the selfie yacht of the celebrities is safely making its way to the shores of Israel. Sabine Haddad, a spokesperson for Israel's Interior Ministry, said that activists who were being deported on Tuesday had waived their right to appear before a judge. Those who did not will face one and will be held for 96 hours before being deported. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot says on Tuesday that one of the detained French activists signed an expulsion order and will leave Israel on Tuesday for France. The other 5 refused. He said all the activists received consular visits. Adala said that Israel had no legal authority to take over the ship because the group said it was in international waters and it was headed not to Israel but to the territorial waters of the State of Palestine. Amnesty International said Israel was flouting international law with the naval raid and called on Israel to release the activists immediately and unconditionally. The arrest of the unarmed activists who operated in a civilian manner to provide humanitarian aid amounts to a serious breach of international law, Adala said. And that article was written by Xander Eliards. From The National, Tuesday the 10th of June 2025, from the news section. Luxury Scottish Highland Lodge business on North Coast 500 up for sale for £850,000. Article written by Laura Pollock. A Highland Lodge business next to the world-famous North Coast 500 route with its own private woodland has gone up for sale. Located in Kilmuir, Collinacredge Lodges is approximately 10 minutes by car to Inverness city centre. The estate is described as being within a 12-acre plot of private woodland known as Craigbreck Wood and boasts 3 luxury solid log Canadian-style lodges. One lodge sits in a small clearing in the woodland with a hot tub on the private decking, with a log burner inside the cabin. Another is marketed as looking towards a small lock-in within the woodland, providing complete privacy. The listing for the estate states the retreat has been developed and operated by a family lifestyle owner, but the business could equally support remote ownership to release the exceptional owner's lodge. Gary Whittam, director at Christie & Co., who is managing the sale, said, Colnacreg has been an amazing beauty and tranquility to it, despite being so close to the main hub of Inverness. The business can be taken in various directions going forward and would sit well either as part of a leisure portfolio or continuing in owner operation. Colnacred lodges are on the market with a freehold asking price of £850,000. Planning permission is in place, subject to conditions, to add a further 2 lodges. And that article was written by Laura Pollock.
This is from The National on Tuesday the 10th of June 2025, from the comments section. Here's what will work and what won't if we're going to stop reform. This article is by Colin Fox. Britain/Scotland/Hamilton, delete as applicable, is broken. Britain/Scotland/Hamilton needs reform is a clever slogan. It resonates with millions of people because it speaks to the way they feel that nothing works properly anymore, and it forces Nigel Farage's opponents onto ground they do not want to inhabit, namely agreeing with him. Writing in the Daily Express on May 28th, the former BBC politics presenter and Sunday Times editor, Andrew Neil, predicted Farage is on the cusp of power and set to become the next Prime Minister. Financial Times columnist Robert Shrimsley was a little more circumspect 2 days later on Farage's prospects, but nonetheless agreed Reform are the beneficiary of a historic Tory collapse at a time when the Labour government has rapidly become unpopular. Reform, insisted Shrimsley, are now attempting to place themselves in the electoral sweet spot of social conservatism and leftist economics. Farage attracts those who see the enemy of my enemy as my friend. Voters who hold Keir Starmer and the Tories and the SNP responsible for breaking Britain/Scotland opt for the person the political establishment apparently hates most. Farage's politics are, of course, those of protest. Yet, as the saying goes, any fool can burn down a barn. It takes brains to construct solutions and remove persistent obstacles. Starmer, meanwhile, continues perversely to be Farage's biggest recruiting sergeant. The Prime Minister, who never visited Hamilton despite being in the vicinity last week, claimed Davy Russell's win for Scottish Labour was a vote for change. You couldn't make it up. That's the one thing it doesn't represent. The surprise, if brief, resignation of Bellshill-born Reform UK chairman Zia Yusuf was interpreted by some commentators as a sign of the implosion long predicted for Farage's party. His return just 2 days later somehow amplified the volatility and deep-seated divisions within the party between its hardliners and those like Yusuf who wish to move it more towards the centre. Reform are, of course, a mass of such contradictions. Their ranks are made up largely of former Tory members from the right of that party, while their electoral base is provided mainly by former Labour voters. A party that faces far right on immigration and law and order, for example, and occasionally leftward on nationalisation, sacking fat cat bosses at Thames Water, and claims to be the party of working people, is just not opportunist, it's organically unstable. Reform UK now has hundreds of inexperienced councillors running dozens of local authorities, as well as a brace of new mayors who are expected to deliver on the promises made to the electorate in May. But they won't, of course. Reform's record in office will come under intense scrutiny with inevitable consequences. Let's not forget that Farage's two previous political iterations, UKIP and the Brexit Party, also imploded amid bitter acrimony. The Reform which was seen on the streets after the Southport stabbings in July last year, for example, belongs to the far right of any spectrum. Furthermore, parties like his that grow too fast tend to come unstuck just as quickly. The SNP are a case in point, with membership now 1/3 of the size it was in the aftermath of the 2014 independence referendum. Without a clear ideological grounding, Reform are just as vulnerable to the iron law of politics that insists there must be a unique material reason for their existence. To stop Reform, you need to combat the reasons for their rise. Tony Blair once airily promised to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, admittedly to no avail. Intelligent analysis of the reasons behind Farage's popularity, and indeed Starmer's unpopularity, must surely be the starting point for any successful strategy to halt their advance. So the question is, do we, as Reform UK's opponents, merely coalesce around a Stop Farage coalition, as First Minister John Swinney advocates? No, certainly not. That would be fatal, for it would be seen by the wider electorate as aligning with those responsible for the failures inherent in that Broken Britain statement. That kind of mindless popular front achieves nothing. Do we instead confront the concerns voters have about the fact Britain is broken? Yes, we do. Do we campaign for an alternative programme that addresses the real concerns voters have on the economy, the state of the NHS, social care, education, the climate, law and order, and independence? Yes, exactly that. In other words, we confront the causes of reform as well as reform itself. Periods of acute political polarisation like this one offer opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The anti-poll tax campaign, the anti-war movement, and the Palestinian cause today are classic examples of this phenomenon. Above all, however, those of us on the left of politics need to encourage Scotland's working class majority to get more involved in campaigns and initiatives that are aimed at securing improvements in the quality of life they want for themselves and their children. And that article was written by Colin Fox and read by Lynn McNeil.
The National News on Wednesday the 11th of June. Controversial Loch Lomond Flamingoland plans are recalled. An article written by Alistair Ferguson. Controversial plans to build a resort on the banks of Loch Lomond have been recalled by Scottish ministers after they were approved. Last month, the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division gave notice that the reporter in charge of the case would allow the appeal for the Flamingoland Resort after it was rejected by the local authority. In September 2024, the Yorkshire-based theme park operator Flamingoland Limited had its planning permission in principle rejected by all 14 board members of the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs Planning Authority. Now, plans for the development at Lomond Banks have been recalled by Scottish ministers. Minister for Public Finance Ivan McKee said that he's recalled the plans as the proposed development raises issues of national significance. He said, "I've decided to recall the Lomond Banks appeal as the proposed development raises issues of national significance in view of its potential impact on Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park. This means that the appeal should be determined at a national level." The news comes after more than 50,000 people wrote to Mr McKee in just 2 weeks, demanding that the Scottish Government withdraws its approval of the mega resort planning application. Scottish Greens MSP Ross Greer said that the public's opinion on the proposal, which is the most opposed in Scottish planning history, with more than 155,000 individuals lodging objections, couldn't be clearer. He said, "I'm glad that Ivan McKee has decided to do the right thing and use his power to intervene to protect Loch Lomond from destruction. The evidence of the damage it would do to one of Scotland's most iconic locations is overwhelming. Once ministers consider the flood risk, the loss of ancient woodland, hundreds of additional cars which would be brought onto notoriously congested roads, and the litany of other devastating impacts it would have, I'm sure that they will reject the mega resort application and finally end this decade-long saga." Organisations such as the National Trust for Scotland, the Woodland Trust, the Ramblers and the Scottish Government environment watchdog SEPA also raised objections against the plans. The £40 million proposal for the resort includes plans for more than 100 holiday lodges, 2 hotels, a water park, a monorail, 372 car parking spaces, shops and more on the site called Lomond Banks. Mr Greer added, "People across Scotland expect their government to protect our national heritage. Given previous mistakes, including the approval of Donald Trump's golf course despite local objections and serious environmental concerns, this is an opportunity for ministers to show that they have learned and will now put people and planet ahead of greedy developers." An article written by Alistair Ferguson. The National Politics on Wednesday the 11th of June. Labour MSP David Russell is sworn in to the Scottish Parliament. An article written by Steph Braun. New MSP David Russell has been sworn in to the Scottish Parliament. The Labour MSP, who won the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election last week, took the oath in Edinburgh on Tuesday afternoon. He stood next to Labour leader Anna Sawar as he was sworn in, before shaking the hand of the presiding officer, Alison Johnston. He becomes Scottish Labour's 23rd MSP, after Mr Russell gained the seat for the party from the SNP for the first time since it was created in 2011. The by-election was held following the death of the SNP's Christina McKelvey. Former local government worker Mr Russell, who is 63, became known throughout the by-election for dodging television debates and interviews, with opponents branding him the Invisible Man throughout campaigning. But he still managed to beat the SNP by more than 600 votes, in a result considered a shock. The SNP came second, attracting 29.4% of the vote, while Reform UK came in third, garnering support from 26.2% of voters. Despite their success, Scottish Labour won the seat on less than a third of the vote, and Professor Sir John Curtis warned that the party is more or less back to where it was in 2021. He added that the vote result showed that there was a chunk of pro-yes voters who had backed Labour in the 2024 general election and have not returned to the SNP fold. Professor Curtis said that Reform UK's vote share had been a bit of a surprise given the national polls. First Minister John Swinney said that the SNP came frustratingly close to winning the election after he was criticised for implementing a strategy of pitting the party against Reform in what he dubbed late on as a two-horse race between the two parties. He said that the party had made modest progress since its collapse at last year's general election, when it dropped from 48 MPs to just 9, but had further to go. Former SNP MP Tommy Shepherd called the SNP campaign strategy foolish in a piece for The National this week. He said it had been a disaster to paint the by-election as a race between the SNP and Reform UK. Dr Michael Higgins, a political communications expert at the University of Strathclyde, also said that the SNP had demeaned themselves by focusing on Reform UK in the by-election campaign. An article written by Steph Braun. The National. Politics on Wednesday the 11th of June. The Scottish Government learned of the winter fuel payment U-turn on social media. An article written by Xander Elliots. The UK Government has not told its Scottish counterpart how much extra funding it can expect from Rachel Reeves's U-turn on winter fuel payments, and instead left SNP ministers to learn of the policy switch through social media, Scotland's Social Justice Secretary has said. Speaking to the BBC yesterday morning, Shirley-Anne Somerville said that the lack of communication from the Labour administration in London was no way for the governments to work together. It came after the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, confirmed on Monday that the winter fuel payment, which she cut back soon after taking power, would be largely reinstated, with payments of £200 to £300 to every pensioner household with an annual income below £35,000. Asked about the U-turn, Ms Somerville said it was a mistake to try and take money away from pensioners in the first place. She went on, "The U-turn is welcome, but I think it points to a rather shambolic way to make policy, which does have implications on the Scottish Government because we're in a system where we're inextricably linked to spending decisions and policy decisions from Westminster. It's very difficult to try and run a devolved social security system when you're actually finding out some of the details on social media before you can actually find out the details from the government. Now, that's no way for the governments to work together, and I'm deeply disappointed, welcoming the U-turn, but deeply disappointed in the way that the UK government has handled this once again with the Scottish Government." Since the U-turn from Ms Reeves, Labour has been pushing for the SNP to triple the winter fuel payment in Scotland, which is set at a baseline of £100. However, Ms Somerville said that people on pension credit in Scotland would already get payments similar to those south of the border. She said that people who are not on pension credit would get £100, people on pension credit and under 80 would get £203, and people on pension credit and over 80 would get £305. Asked if the SNP might up the payments due to the extra funding which is set to come from Labour's U-turn, Ms Somerville said, "We're still waiting for the confirmation of whether there's any funding implications from the Chancellor's announcement, with no details of how that scheme will work. We've no idea what the implications will be," she added. Ms Somerville further said that she hoped the Chancellor would use her spending review to also reverse the £5 billion cuts to disability benefits and to end the two-child cap on benefits. "I hope that the Labour Chancellor will do that," she said. "That's the right thing to do. She has the opportunity again, and I hope she doesn't turn her back on it once again." Scottish Secretary Ian Murray, also appearing on the BBC yesterday, said that the UK government would never consult devolved governments on devolved policy. Asked if cutting the winter fuel payment after taking power had been a mistake, Mr Murray said, "No, it was the right thing to do at the time." He insisted that the U-turn is only possible because the UK's economy is improving, an assertion which has been questioned by experts. Pushed on why the Labour government had not informed the SNP administration of its policy plans or their implications, Mr Murray dodged the question. Asked again, he said, how much extra the Scottish Government is going to get. Well, of course, it would be Barnett consequentials on that, which will be calculated in the usual way at the usual time when the policy is finalised. Mr Murray was then pushed again on whether Social Justice Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville is correct when she says that they're trying to develop policy here, but they never know what's happening at a London level. The Scottish Secretary said, well, hold on a second, we never consult the Scottish Government on policy that is devolved. And if we did consult the Scottish Government on policy that was devolved, they'd be screaming blue murder at the fact that we're encroaching on the devolution settlement. It's up to the Scottish Government under devolution to decide how they spend that. We've got 1 in 6 Scots on the NHS waiting lists, so they're not spending it on the NHS. We've got an increasing educational attainment gap, so they're not spending it on education. So Scottish voters were very right to ask where the money is being spent, and why it's not being spent on their priorities. An article written by Xander Elliotts.
This is from The National on Thursday, 12th June 2025, from the Culture section. Scots Language Awards officially launched for 2025 by Fiona Brown. An awards ceremony celebrating the use of Scots language has been launched for 2025 and is set to return to the West Coast again for this year's celebrations. The Scots Language Awards, organised by Hands Up for Trad, a group that promotes traditional Scottish music in the mainstream media, was launched for 2025 on Thursday and will take place in Cumnock Town Hall, Ayrshire, again on 13th September. The annual ceremony aims to recognise figures and organisations that encourage the use of Scots language in wider society, and categories will include business, literature, community work and more. Simon Thumier, Scots Language Award organiser and Hands Up for Trad creative director, said, "The Scots lead is gone from strength to strength, and we're thrilled to see the Scots Language Awards return to Ayrshire, home to such a rich cultural heritage. This event isn't just a celebration of the wonderful talents of Scots music, literature and community endeavours, but a recognition of the lead's vital role in our Scottish identity. We can't wait to bring Scots language community together again, and with the new initiatives like the Scots House School Sessions, we are ensuring the next generation can share in pride and passion for our mother tongue. It's set to be a nicht to remember, and we can't wait."
The launch coincides with Gears a Scots Poem Day 2025, an initiative created by the Scottish Poetry Library, which aims to promote Scots language poetry in all of its forms, including Doric, Shetlandic and Dundonian. East Ayrshire Provost Claire Leach said, "I'm awfu' chuffed that the Scots Language Award will return to East Ayrshire this year. I'm looking forward to going along celebrating the talented performers and all the folk fae across Scotland who are dedicated to encouraging us to use our mother tongue. It's going to be a stoter of a night." For me, there's nothing more important than staying true to who we are and encouraging our communities and ways to use and celebrate the Scots language. Definitely, get yourself a ticket quick. As Jack fae Still Game says, "He who hingeth about getteth hee-haw." Hands Up for Trad are also partnering with learning resource Scots Hoose to deliver Scots language lessons in schools across the country. A range of musicians and poets will perform at the ceremony this year, including Edinburgh Scots singer Amy Leach and local Burns purveyor Willie Dick. Scots Language Awards nominations will be open from July 28th until August 10th, with voting for shortlisted nominees taking place from August 25th until September 7th. Further information regarding ticketing will be available on the event's website soon. That article was by Fiona Brown. This is from The National on Thursday, 12th June 2025, from the Sport section. Nielsen Angelo breaks silence on Celtic transfer interest, by Mark Walker. Celtic target Nielsen Angelo has broken his silence on the Hoops' interest and insisted he's only concentrating on playing for Anderlecht next season. The Scottish champions have been linked with a move for the talented winger who enjoyed a breakthrough season in Belgium. Angelo helped Ecuador qualify for the World Cup next year after they managed 2 goalless draws against Brazil and Peru to reach the finals. And he was quizzed about Celtic's reported interest in his homeland. He said, "I'm focused on Anderlecht. I want to go back there and we'll see what happens. Next season, I need to improve on small details like my finishing, and as I play more matches for Anderlecht and my national team, I'll improve. I'm really happy with what we've achieved and very proud of the group. We're prepared and focused on the World Cup. The Ecuadorian people deserve this more than anyone else, and I'm very happy about that. I feel very good about my performances and I feel proud of each of my teammates." That article was by Mark Walker. This is from The National on Thursday, 12th June 2025, from the Sport section. Rangers linked star set for transfer to European giants, by Ewan Payton. Luka Modric is set to complete his move to a fellow European giant upon his departure from Real Madrid. The former Ballon d'Or winner will leave the Bernabeu after this summer's Club World Cup in the USA. The Croatia captain, who was tentatively linked with a sensational move to Rangers last month, is set to join AC Milan. That's according to Fabrizio Romano, who states that a medical is organised. The transfer guru wrote on X, Luka Modric is to undergo medical and complete formal steps of AC Milan move after the Club World Cup. No signature official steps before that, as Modric wants to focus on Real Madrid at the best level possible until the end. Modric has nearly 600 appearances to his name for Real, winning a staggering 6 Champions League trophies in that time since his transfer from Tottenham in 2012. The links with Rangers arose when David Ancelotti was believed to be in the running to become the next head coach of the Ibrox club. However, after whittling down their candidates, the Rangers board opted to offer the position to Russell Martin, who has been in the post for a week. Ancelotti has rejoined his dad's backroom staff, now at the Brazil national team. That article was by Ewan Payton.
That concludes this week's edition of the National Podcast. Please remember to subscribe to our channels at Tune Review and to tell your friends about our service.